Hi, this is Kathy from Gadgets Top 321, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at my 5 currently inked pens. I'll do a writing sample on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper so you can see why these are some of my favorite pen and ink combinations. I'm going to begin with my Pilot E95S. It has a 14 karat fine nib. I've got it inked up with KWZ Honey. It writes smoothly and uniformly in every direction. It puts down a significantly finer line when I reverse write. It's quite a bit drier, but it's really pleasant if you need a much finer line, especially because this E95S fine nib is a bit wetter than most of Pilot's fine nibs. It's nice to have something that's much finer and a bit drier if you need to fit into a tight space. I did have to smooth mine on the reverse side just a little bit. I think it was a little bit scratchy it was scratchy in the side directions. So I just used a little micro mesh, did some side strokes for a bit, and then did some figure eights, tested it out. Now it's a very pleasant reverse writer. Like I said, this E95S is a pretty wet writer, so it has no trouble keeping up with quick writing. Next, I've got a Lamy CP1. I bought it with a stainless steel medium nib, but then I replaced it with an extra fine. I've got it inked up with Iroshizuku Yama-budo. You can see that this Lamy Extra Fine is the same width, maybe even a little bit wider than the Pilot E95S Fine. And this Pilot Fine nib is a hair wider than most other Pilot Fine nibs. So this Extra Fine is not very extra fine, but I really enjoy it. It writes nice and uniformly in every direction. The reverse writing is pleasant and it's a bit finer than the regular writing. With this nice vibrant ink, the reverse writing is very legible, very pleasant, a bit drier than the regular writing, but useful in a situation where you're needing to write very small or you're needing your pen to write a bit drier. And again, no trouble at all keeping up with quick writing. Next, I've got my Pilot Legno with the red finish. It has a 14 karat fine nib, and you can see that this is a Pilot number 3 size nib. I've got it inked up with Iroshizuku Tsuki-yo. This pen shares a characteristic that's common with a lot of my 14 karat Pilot fine nibs. It writes a bit drier in the up direction, and I kind of like that. It gives my writing a little character. My Pilot steel fine nibs write uniform in every direction, and there are certain inks that I like to use with those nibs, but with the 14 karat nibs, I get a little bit of line variation. You can see the upstroke is a bit lighter than the other three directions. So I get a little variation. You get a little bit of shading, just not even hardly noticeable, but just enough to give your writing some character. The reverse writing with this nib is very fine, very dry. It feels like it's going to dry out and stop writing, but it never does. So if you have to write microscopic, this would be useful. Again, no problems keeping up with quick writing, but you do see a little bit of line variation, like I said you get with this Pilot fine nib. Next, I've got a Zebra V301 fountain pen. It has a stainless steel, I guess you would call this like a semi-hooded nib, and if you look closely underneath, let's see, underneath the nib, between the nib and the plastic part of the feed, you see a little black piece extending out under there. That is a fiber feed. It was white. I should have pointed it out before I put the ink cartridge in it in my previous video, but that was white when I first got the pen, and it's black now because it's saturated in ink. This is inked up with one of the included ink cartridges. To my knowledge, there's not or Zebra, I don't believe, makes a converter for this fountain pen, but it comes with, let's see, two of these ink cartridges, and you can just refill them. I have to say, this is not one of my favorite pen and ink combinations. The ink is very feathery. It soaks into the paper very quickly. Now, it's pleasant enough to use on this Tomoe River paper, but there are fountain pen friendly papers that it is very unpleasant to use on. Let me go ahead and write down if this was an ink cartridge. Now, when I first started using this pen, when I first got it, it was scratchy in the left direction. So I did do a little smoothing with some micro mesh, and now it's very pleasant. The reverse writing, also when I first got it, was a little too feedbacky for my taste. So again, I ran it over some micro mesh, and now it's very pleasant in both directions. My only gripe with this pen is I'm not fond of the ink. It's able to keep up with some quick writing. Now, when I first started using this pen, I thought it was a dry writer because the ink was soaking into the paper so quickly, but I think this seems to be a fairly decently wet writer. And finally, I've got a Pilot Petite 1. It has a stainless steel fine nib, similar to what you would find on a Pilot Varsity. I've got it inked up with, I believe it's Sailor Ink Studio 143. If it's not, I'll make a note here in the video. It writes nice and uniformly in every direction. The reverse writing is fantastic. You get a nice difference in line width, so you have some options here when you're using this pen. And it has no trouble keeping up with fast writing. When I was doing my ink test for KWZ Honey, one of the pens I tested it with was my E95S, and it was love at first sight. And so now every time I use this pen, KWZ Honey is my first choice to use with it. Now, I recently mentioned that I was considering getting this nib ground to a fine stub nib. You know, I've got a pen show coming up that I might be able to go to, and so I was considering taking this pen with me. But after using it for journaling with this KWZ Honey, there's no way. I'm just going to leave it the way it is. Now, one issue I've had with this pen is as I use it, if I'm not paying attention, my grip tends to slide down, and if my thumb comes into contact with this seam between the nib and the body of the pen, my thumb just gets covered in ink. And I was using this pen to take some notes, and about an hour and a half into it, I noticed my thumb had crept down and was just covered with KWZ Honey. So for shorter writing, I'm able to pay attention and keep my thumb away from the nib. But for longer writing sessions, I get distracted and inevitably my thumb gets covered in ink. This is another pen and ink combination that was love at first sight. When I originally got this CP1, I got it with a medium nib, and I think that's the same time that I got the Lamy blue-black ink cartridges. And so that medium nib and the Lamy blue-black just didn't work for me. I think maybe it's because the medium nib spreads the ink out a little bit more, and it makes it look pale and yuck. The Lamy blue-black, I've used it with my Lamy gold extra fine nib, and I think it's putting the same amount of ink down, but it's in a more concentrated fine line, and I like it just fine. Now, since I wasn't fond of that medium nib, I bought an extra fine replacement nib and just slid the medium nib off and slid the extra fine on it. And I didn't find myself using this pen. But I was doing a writing test for Noodler's Cactus Fruit Eel, and this was one of the pens I used in my writing test, and it was love at first sight. And I do like using Cactus Fruit Eel with this pen. The only deal with Cactus Fruit Eel is as it sets in the pen, it gets more concentrated and it just does not want to dry. You know, Noodler's inks, some of them tend to be like that. They're so concentrated. But I've got a couple of small bottles of this Yama-budo, so this is going to be my go-to ink for this pen, I have a feeling, for a long time. Now, Iroshizuku Tsuki-yo is probably, I don't know if it's my favorite, it's one of my favorite inks to use in a Pilot Fine nib. Like I mentioned, in my Pilot Fine nibs, the upstroke is a little bit drier, and it just makes Tsuki-yo look so good. And it kind of tames Tsuki-yo a little bit. Tsuki-yo tends to be one of the wetter of my Iroshizuku inks, and they balance each other out. I enjoy using those two together. Now, when I was thinking about what I was going to say about this zebra, one of the things I was going to say is I can't wait till I'm done with this ink cartridge so I can try some other inks and find an ink that pairs with this a little bit better. And then I thought, why am I going to use this ink that I can't stand, that doesn't work on most of my papers? So since my Petite 1 is almost out of ink, really the only ink in it is just what's in the converter right now. I might do a little bit more writing with it to get the last little bit of ink out of there, enjoy the last little bit of it. And when I clean this one out, I'm cleaning out this cartridge, and I'm going to try to find an ink that works well in this pen, that pairs well with it. I was pleasantly surprised that this Sailor Chromo Shading ink that I was having trouble finding a pen for it to work well in. It's one of the chromo shading inks that's not too pale, but if your pen doesn't put down enough ink, it is a little too pale. It looks perfect. It looks the way I want it to look in this Petite one. And it also has a fiber feed. It doesn't stick out from under the nib like the zebra feed does, but since the plastic part of the feed is transparent in this pen, you can see it running through under there. And it was also white until I put ink in it. And I don't really have any trouble cleaning it out. I use my bulb syringe and flush ink through it, and it cleans it out pretty good, and I'm able to use various colors of ink. I think I'm going to try a chromo shader in this one and see if it works as well as it did in my Petite one. Alright, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.